Hey there, this is Derek Murphy. It is November 1st in Taiwan, and I'm beginning to write my Nanowrimo project. I wanted to make a quick video showing you what I'm working on and some last-minute Nanowrimo tips. I haven't really kept track, but I've done many NaNoWrimos, and you can see here I've got a few playlists about Preptober, NaNoWrimo, some of the most important and necessary writing tips that I think new writers should be aware of. I've also rented a few castles for NaNoWrimo and got featured in CNN, so it's something that I have liked to do, but this year I'm taking it pretty easy. And one of the main differences for me right now is that I'm not working on a new project. I'm trying to finish one of my older projects. So this is the Scarlet Thread. This is one of my first NaNoWrimo projects, one of the first books that I wrote, something like 6 years ago. NaNoWrimo is excellent for giving yourself the time and the space to write because there's a lot of new skills that you need to develop. And often when you first start writing, it can feel sort of overwhelming, like you don't have a goal, you don't know what the purpose is. So NaNoWrimo, in a sense, gives you permission to write badly. You don't really have to write something that's publishable. It's about creating a writing habit and getting comfortable with the blank page. And one of the things that I've seen coming up recently, especially on Facebook or a lot of Reddit groups, is that a lot of last-minute NaNoWrimo people are ditching whatever plans or projects they had already come to terms with, things they had decided to work on for NaNoWrimo, and they are going with something totally new and fresh instead. And that's totally a personal choice. Everybody writes for different reasons, and it's possible that a lot of people do NaNoWrimo just to kind of get back into the creative feeling. And it is true that when you pant something, it does feel more magical. When you don't go into it with a plan and you just kind of figure stuff out, it feels like you're doing something really creative and really impressive. It feels more satisfying. It can help you to get your creative juices back. So I understand why that's less scary for some people. It also frees them from, I have this project that I care about, that I want to finish, that I want it to be good. And those are all kind of negative attributes to bring into your NaNoWrimo project, because then your results or your victory will be tied to the quality of your output. So if you've never done NaNoWrimo before and you just want to, dive into it without a plan, that's totally fine. That's kind of, I think, how I wrote my first book. I had a sort of setup of some cliches, some tropes, a genre, but I was making up a lot of it as I went. And like I said, this first book I don't think is my greatest book, in the world, but it's for 50 or 60,000 words. I wrote it in a month, and it's good enough to have over 1,000 reviews. So I'm happy with what it is. But also, this is a first book in a series, and with first books, you can add a lot of mystery and intrigue without really wrapping things up or doing, deeper character or plot development. But the other thing that I've seen that is a little more worrying are a lot of people saying, I'm a diehard pantser, I hate outlining, this is just who I am as a person. I've been doing NaNoWrimo for 10 years and I've never finished a book. I see a lot of that stuff, and my response has been, do whatever works for you, but the thing that worked for you the first time you did NaNoWrimo may not be the thing that you need the 6th or the 10th time you do NaNoWrimo. Hopefully you're growing as a writer, and if you've never finished a publishable book before, then there's probably a problem with your process. So for me, it was definitely true. Even though I liked the idea of NaNoWrimo for a lot of reasons that I'll get into later, I had trouble finishing my first book. And the main thing that I had trouble with originally was the story I wanted to tell was too big. I was trying to write a mermaid fantasy story, which was actually this one, Song of Tide. It's got about 1,700 reviews now. And when I first published this, it was, I think, 50 or 60,000 words. And I wasn't happy with it because I basically only got to the midpoint of my story. And then it was a big mess because I wrote the other half of it and I republished it all as one big long book. I think it's like 150,000 words. But I could not get to the end of this book because I was trying to write it all at once. So by breaking it into halves and saying, I just want to get to, the cliffhanger ending of the first half, that allowed me to really focus on how do I write a strong first half of a novel and not worry about all the ending resolution stuff. I did have a lot of trouble with plotting and outlining, though. I've since on my blog added this 24 chapter outline, which I think, is a little different than the hero's journey and a lot of other people's plot outlines. I know everybody loves Save the Cat or maybe the snowflake method. But the main problem is that generally a three-act structure for narrative story is meant for screenplay or movies, and Act Two is a third of the story, when in a novel, Act Two is actually half of the story. So a lot of writers will use some kind of a structure, and then they say it doesn't help them because they got lost in the middle, they have a soggy middle, they're not sure how to go about that. So I put all of the different things together into this structure, which has been pretty popular. It's already been implemented into Plotter and Scrivener and a lot of the bigger writing tools. And I think I've gotten, a few million views on my YouTube videos about this plotting structure. So this definitely works. I've got a lot of good feedback. And this is what I use to write my stories. So that said, even though I have a 24 chapter outline, and I'll show you in a minute what my outline actually looks like for this particular project that I'm working on right now. But it's not necessarily overdeveloped. It starts with just a very general, what kind of thing might be happening in this section of the story so that I can brainstorm in the right direction. And then I can choose the right narrative story threads or plot events that I can put in that section that brings my story forward. So even though there's this huge argument about pantsing versus outlining, and I definitely feel like I'm more of an outliner, there's also sort of two types of the creative brain, the one that makes stuff up and the one that does the editing and the processing and makes it all organized. So different styles of writers will have different strengths. But in my opinion, it's always a balance of both of these things. Even if I have a really tight outline, even if I know exactly what's going to happen in a scene, I haven't actually written the words yet. And when you're putting the words down to describe that scene, you're always pantsing in a sense because you're making things up on the fly. Things will always bubble to the surface that you didn't expect. So I don't feel like I'm not a pantser because I'm doing the work of pantsing whenever I'm filling in my outline. I would just caution against making either of these your identity and saying, this is just who I am, this is what's comfortable for me, so this is the style of writing that I'm drawn to. I don't feel like anybody is born a talented writer. This is a skill you can develop. We all have a baseline that's different for each of us, depending on our unique gifts. But we should all be striving to get better at the things that maybe don't feel as comfortable for us. And personally, I think if you want to finish a satisfying novel that is good enough for other people to appreciate, rather than just writing for yourself or for creative expression, outlining is kind of it's not even like a secret bullet or a magic bullet. It just works really, really well. And I find it odd that some writers are absolutely against it. Not in terms of, is this a useful skill, but in terms of this is not my core identity. So that said, writing and editing are two different skills. They're different parts of your brain. When you're writing a novel, when you're doing Nanowrimo, you're going to be doing both of these things at different points of time. So you need to be aware of what I'm actually doing right now and what kind of brain activity should I be focused on using. And then you want to try to make sure you're setting up your space, your music, your lighting, whatever, to bring out that particular activity. So how this works for me is I have my big messy manuscript, which I'll show you. I use Microsoft Word still. There are some pretty good writing software that just helps you to organize everything, that could help you to make sense of it all. The problem is, I think either you need a writing software to do all the brainstorming and to keep track of all your notes and all your character descriptions and stuff like that, so that when you're writing it makes it easier to find all your stuff, or you finish a really messy NaNoWriMo project that's a pile of crap, and then you have to try to force it into coherence. And I don't know that any writing software is really great for that either. These are high level, very difficult skills to develop. And I think any software you find that makes it a little bit easier is great. But I also would say don't hope that any writing software is just going to fix the challenge of doing this, because, putting it all together takes a ton of time and effort, but it also takes a lot of experience. Once I've got my scene in my manuscript file, which means in my plot outline, I basically kind of know what's going to happen next. Then I'll open AI Writer, which is an iPhone app. on my iPhone with a Bluetooth keyboard. This is what I like the most, because then I'll go out to coffee, I'll buy, some nice cake or whatever, set a timer, and for 30 minutes to 2 hours, I'll just write that scene. And I can tend to get 3,000 or 4,000 words, in 2 or 3 hours if I'm really working at it. I'll probably start with a little bullet point of what things are going to happen in that scene. And then once I'm done, I'll probably end it with another bullet point, brainstorming where does the story go from here. Even though I do a pretty tight plot outline, there's always room for discovery. And often, even if I think my plot outline is perfect, when I get to chapter 13, I write chapter 13, the things that happen next may be totally different from where I thought I was in my manuscript. So you're always sort of open to that potential. What I think you want to be most careful about is this, problem solving on the fly. So I've seen a lot of people say, day one of NaNoWriMo, they got started, but they're stuck already because now they're inventing character names, or they're naming locations, or they're figuring out, what actually happens in their story. So this is all part of writing a novel, but the challenge is NaNoWriMo is really about putting words down on the page. And if you're doing all of your discovery and problem solving in the process, you're not really accounting for the time that's going to take you. Or maybe it feels like you're not doing the work. Like if you're stuck on your story because you don't know what happens next, that might take a whole day just for you to resolve and figure out. Like the brain doesn't fill in the blanks until you reach the canyon or the valley or whatever. Like you have to get to the point where you're stuck before your brain starts giving you solutions. And so you can't solve everything before you start writing your novel, but you definitely don't want to get stuck halfway through because you've written yourself in a corner, or maybe you've gotten to the ending too fast, or maybe you went completely off the rails, or possibly you're halfway through, your story's off the rails, but you just want to finish NaNoWriMo, so you just keep writing crap for another 2 weeks, and you end up with stuff that is not usable or even very good. And so then, yay, you're successful, you wrote the 50K, but is that really a creative exercise that you needed that's helping you to become a better writer? It is, though, significantly easier in a lot of respects to start from a blank page or a fresh story. And like I told you, it does feel a lot better. It feels satisfying because you're doing fun, creative work. And I'm actually finding that most of this year I was doing, busy work and not working on my writing. And now day one of NaNoWriMo, I feel a lot more creative and a lot more inspired just because I'm working on my own fiction again. But the real challenge for writers is that a blank page and fresh story always feels better and more rewarding than a pile of crap. But the truth is, every writer has to, and I know people say like this can't be universally true, even though it is a kind of a platitude that your first draft is always shit. A lot of famous writers say that. When you write a first draft, it's probably going to be pretty bad, even if the story is there. That doesn't mean you've written a bad novel. You're just in the first quarter of a 4-stage process to get that pile of crap into something good. So a lot of writers give up there because they write their pile of crap and then they don't know how to edit it or revise it or fix it. So instead of fixing it, they just go back, every year and they write a fresh story for years and years. Which again, nothing wrong with that unless, you've been doing NaNoWriMo for a decade and you've never finished anything that you've submitted to agents or published, possibly because you're getting stuck at this stage, which is a different process altogether. It can be a lot more frustrating and exhausting, often because this is just fun, creative ideas, and this is the limit of your experience and education, which means you're going to actually have to learn things that are going to be difficult. This is a new skill that's going to be hard for you, and that doesn't feel very creative or very rewarding, but it's a necessary part of the process. If you are writing a blank page or a fresh story, I actually have a bunch of other videos on NaNoWriMo tips and self-editing and all sorts of writing advice. But one easy thing I think would be focusing on scene descriptions and what happens. So in your first version of your story, I started with this because you can't really go wrong with scene description. It always makes your story seem more 3D, have more depth, more engaging. So the problem is like you don't want only scene description with nothing happening, and the actual driver of dramatic story is always conflict and intrigue. Conflict is, things that are opposed in some way. and intrigue is things that might be opposed in the future, or might have conflict in the future, but we're not really sure about. I think I have videos on both of these, but you've got to have conflict in every scene, or at least the potential for conflict, which is intrigue. And those are super important. So you might have just a whole bunch of battle scenes and a whole bunch of, fighting and arguing and stuff, which is actually melodrama often, when you don't give your characters enough room to grow and they're just reactive or emotional, and they kind of fly off the handle and get in fights. That can feel really melodramatic. But my initial point is basically, if you're making up cool descriptions of characters and cool descriptions of scenes, if that's done really well, that can be really valuable content, because you're basically picturing the story in your mind. And once you've pictured the story in your mind, it's a lot more easy to write about it and to figure out what happens in the context of that scene. So when you're stuck and you just need words, I would focus on this. Things that happen, interrupting and making something happen. This is also true. The opposite of conflict is dialogue. So you can always increase conflict by reducing conversation and dialogue. Conversation's almost always boring in terms of when people sit down and talk about the things that they are thinking, or sharing their emotions, or sharing their plans, or whatever. It has its place usually in the later part of a book, when you're deepening the characters before the final drama points, because you want your characters to be more lovable before you put them in tragic situations. But in the beginning, you want to focus on things happening and scene description, world building. And when you get stuck, you can always create interruptions. When things are getting too boring, like when you put everybody in a room together and they don't have an immediate task or goal, you always want to give them something to do that's kind of interesting, or some smaller goal that they need to achieve that they are also blocked from getting. And there will be periods of downtime. I've said before that often my weakest scenes, like when I'm plotting, I plot the action scenes. So I always have these like leftover in between scenes where there's a scene there, but nothing's really happening. And those are the hardest ones to write, but they often end up being the best scenes in the book, because they aren't forced by external conflict, and they have a lot more of the deeper emotional resonance, or even just like the fun, happy moments that become very important in the final battle scene, in the turning point where your protagonist, removes their fatal flaw and becomes the hero. Those little sappy in-between scenes can be really important, but they're probably not what you write first, and they might feel difficult to write until, they gain importance because of the things that are happening elsewhere in your plot later on. And you can't always just have random interruptions, but generally whenever characters are given too much time to sit still and talk to each other, because, if everybody's just sat around talking about their feelings, there'd be no internal conflict, there'd be no doubts or insecurities where you're wondering what other people are thinking or what they're going to do, or you're fearing what's going to happen in the future. If everyone just like casually talks everything out, you'll be getting rid of all of your conflict. That's also true when the protagonist just thinks about their life, or thinks about their past, or just casually like points stuff out as if they were a tour guide in their ordinary world. The protagonist shouldn't be aware of a active author or active reader. The protagonist shouldn't be like performing for an invisible reader who's enjoying the story. You want to be careful about a protagonist who's just talking or thinking to themselves, or talking to themselves out loud and not really doing anything for, chapters at a time while they're hashing through all their childhood incidents. You want the story to start with some action in the ordinary world and show what's actually happening, while you give them more and more interesting new developments or challenges that are beyond their capabilities to easily resolve. A really good story, an engaging story, is also almost always about an impossible mission that forces the character to change. Which means like this story is remarkable, this story is interesting, because this sequence of events is too difficult for the protagonist to deal with currently, given their opinions or beliefs or skill set or whatever. And so you're forcing them into a path that they don't have the means to deal with, which forces them to open up or ask for help or gain new skills or abilities. I do have a 4-step editing process. So when I start writing a first rough draft, I mostly focus on the what, which is just what actually happens, how is the story organized, what are the sequence of the plot events. And that's a pretty good place to start, where you don't overthink all of the other stuff like character motivation or character backstory. In the second draft of editing, once I've done the what, I'll get into the how, which is the practical stuff. How does this actually work? You know, how's the magic work? How does the transportation between events work? How did they get from point A to B? Possibly, what are they wearing? Which I know is a what question, but this is like, how does this look? Or how are they dressed? Things like that. The what is like the what happens, but the how, I think to some extent, is the description. Like, how does this look in my mind when I'm picturing this? This is where I would build up the description and the world building a lot. The why is the deeper character motivations, which are really important, but may not fully be apparent until later. So even after I've got my first rough draft, even my second rough draft, in my third rough draft, I might finally be putting in the really powerful key scenes that motivate the character action, where maybe something happened before, but it wasn't as tragic or as brutal as it could have been. And now I'm, shoring up the conflict, the dramatic tension until it's really cutting it over the top. And then finally, I would get into my now, which is like last minute, sentence by sentence proofreading or line editing. I would focus on like the intro and the outro for every scene or chapter. I'd start formatting a little bit so it gets closer to being something that's ready for other people to read. Anyway, I've got a whole video about these 4 steps, which I think are pretty useful. Now I'm going to show you what my manuscript looks like right now. Hopefully this will be useful for you to see what it might look like for another author to write a whole book, what it actually looks like when you're pulling it all together. And I don't think a lot of other people do this on YouTube, so you might get really useful writing tips, but you don't really actually see the mess behind the scenes, which I think can be useful. There's no one way to write a novel, and I don't think this is necessarily the best way to write a novel, but this is what my process looks like. And this is book 5 of a series, so I'm not really writing a new project. I'm not making up brand new things, although there will be a lot of new characters and new scenes in this book. It's a little trickier because as a 5th book, I have to do a lot of callbacks, a lot of references back to the other books in the series and wrap it all up together in a huge climatic final battle scene. I write in Microsoft Word and I use heading tabs. So if I put this in a style like heading 1, it'll show up here in the navigation pane. So that helps me to stay organized. And you can actually drag and drop things around in Microsoft Word that not everybody knows that. It'll take all the text underneath that heading tag and move it together. And I start off with my 24 chapter plot outline. So if you scroll down a bit over here, you can see these are just the kind of default headers that I have from my 24 chapter plot outline. And I don't even know if I might have filled in some notes to myself that are really messy brainstorming ideas, but I don't really know exactly what's going to happen in all of those places yet. I will also have a lot of sections that are like notes and more notes and outline. And then I might label my chapter heading with the things that happen. Generally, my chapters have 2 scenes. My chapters are like 3,000 or 4,000 words, and I have 2 scenes. So there's one chapter break or one section break between every scene. And then I'll label, what happens in the scene so that I kind of know what's going on at that point in the story. And then I'll just have, more notes. When I get stuck, I'll do another outline. So what I'm trying to do here, even though this is the first day of Nanowrimo, I'm not really focused on writing my words today. I'm just trying to get organized. So I did start work on this book earlier, I think like maybe a year ago. So I've got some stuff. And when I have a pretty clean chapter, I take away all of the description so that I can remind myself that this chapter is kind of okay. I might still have some notes here and there, but these are pretty clean chapters. And then they progressively get less and less clean as it becomes just a whole bunch of random notes that is not pulled together in any way. And what I'm probably trying to do for the first week of NaNoWriMo is get to the midpoint, because this document already has, whoops. So this document's already at 54,000 words, but a lot of it is just rough notes. A lot of it isn't usable yet. And when I get to the midpoint, this book should be about 100,000 words. That's what I'm aiming for. It'll probably be quite a bit longer, but what I'd like to do first is the editing stuff, which is, cleaning up all these notes and turning them into actual chapters. Some of that will be real writing where, I have my plot notes, but I really need to actually go out to a coffee shop and write the scene. So I'll be doing some of that to actually get through this. But I will probably only have like 3 or 4 chapters to get to this midpoint and the death of one of my major characters. I tend to expand quite a bit in edits. So even though I'm just cleaning all this stuff up, I probably will be meeting my word count goals for most of these days anyway. But I might be behind the first week because I'm still doing a lot of organizing, which is okay because for me, that's kind of like sharpening the axe before you go to cut down a tree. If you don't sharpen your axe, if you just have a blunt axe and you're going to go out and chop down a tree, it's going to be a tremendous amount of effort and work and also quite a bit more dangerous to cut that tree down. Whereas if you had spent a day sharpening your axe first before you go out to cut down the tree, everything would be a lot smoother. So my process is once I really start the second half of this book in the last 2 or 3 weeks of November, I probably will have a lot of momentum and a lot of motivation, and I probably won't get stuck because I'm not going to be figuring out what has to happen. I should have a pretty clear idea of a lot of these things. But right now, the whole second half of this book, like I have ideas of what the scene might look like, but this is all going to be new content. So I think it's going to be pretty easy to write those 50,000 words for these 10 chapters or so. That's like 5,000 words a chapter. It should be less than that probably, but I will probably actually add 3 or 4 chapters in between here, which generally tends to happen. The 24 chapter outline is kind of just like a starting point. I also probably at this point won't worry about editing so much. I mentioned those 4 phases of editing that I go through. I'll save that for later, for December or even next year. I'll be happy if I basically add 50,000 words of new content and get this rough draft fleshed out enough so I have something to work on. So that means like for these couple weeks, I'll be going out to the coffee shop, writing 2,000 or 3,000 words a day, and then just putting them into my manuscript here. I use AI Writer on my iPhone, a Bluetooth keyboard. I put them in Dropbox, and then I copy paste them over into this manuscript. And then once I have all that content done, I'll start going through the revisions and the process of cleaning it up and adding in all the scene description and the detail and the conflict and the intrigue and making everything a lot better. I tend to edit probably 3 or 4 times as much as I write. And for some reason, the putting the words down on the page, the drafting phase, is the hardest for me. I know I can do it, and it was mostly NaNoWriMo that got me over that hurdle because I did NaNoWriMo with, really low expectations of just trying to write a book that was good enough for people to enjoy. But I still tend to avoid or procrastinate on the actual writing the stuff down. And I feel a lot more competent or comfortable once I've got a bunch of content and then I'm just working on, now I know what the story is. Now I can just edit it and make it better. Personally, that's where my literary strengths are their finest. You probably have other strengths or skills. There's also going to be things that you feel like you're really good at because they feel like they make you happy. They feel like they're enjoyable for you. So it's a false equivalency to say that like I am good at this because I enjoy this. A lot of writers go into it from that point of view. And like if I'm not enjoying it, then why am I even writing? But just because you enjoy it doesn't necessarily mean other people are going to enjoy it. And there is a lot of skill and craft work involved in writing a book. And luckily, a lot of that can be learnable. So Even if you started off as a really good writer with really good skills, you may be disillusioned or might be at a disadvantage because you think you are good at writing, but then you get stuck with your messy rough draft and you're not really sure what you need to do to fix it. Anyway, I do have a lot of videos about all of this stuff if you want to look further on my channel. This is kind of just a little update on what I'm working on for Nanowrimo. This is one of my favorite projects because it's based on Greek mythology, and I actually got my PhD in comparative literature and ancient mythology, so there's a ton of research. I'm really geeking out on the ancient Norse and Japanese mythologies that I'll be including in this book. But I'm also really excited to finally finish because I started this series like 5 or 6 years ago at least, and this will be my second completed series. Often it's hard to make a living as a writer or to make money with your books until you've got some completed series, at least if you're writing, young adult fantasy or fiction in general. That trend tends to be true in general. So a lot of the books I've written haven't really been profitable, but once I've finally finished a full completed series, I'll start to see some pretty consistent passive income, which means I can focus more of my time on writing. If you've got any questions about Nanowrimo or writing in general, let me know under this video. If you like this video, let me know. That's it. Thanks a lot. Good luck with Nanowrimo. I might check in a couple weeks and do another update. Let me know what you're working on also. If you're working on Nanowrimo, leave me a comment about your project. Thanks. Bye-bye.